Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I'm Colonel Mike Quinn. I'm the Chief of the Warfighter Integration Division here at DTRA-CB Bio. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's panel session, Developing Solutions for the Future Fight. One quick admin note before we get started is we're going to be using Slido for our question and answer session this afternoon. So if you haven't already done so during this morning's sessions, please either download the app or log on to slido.com and choose Ballroom A to make sure your questions get posted to the right session. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this afternoon's panel, Command Master Chief Ibanez. He's the Senior Enlisted Advisor for the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Chief Ibanez is an EOD explosive ordnance disposal technician with over 2 decades of experience. He's held staff and leadership positions across the Navy to include the conventional and special operations side of doing business. So at this time, I'd like to turn the panel over to Chief Ibanez.
Thanks, sir. Hey, thanks, sir. Hey, thank you. Is this on? All right, hey, first and foremost, appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon. On behalf of Mr. Vale Oxford, Director of Defense Threat Reduction Agency. So why is everybody here? We're here for the Warfighter panel. What we've done is assemble some esteemed visitors for you guys today. The format for today is not going to be us up here lecturing, but rather to facilitate a discussion. As the Colonel just mentioned, we have Slido. I have a couple preset questions here, and then you guys have microphones out there in the audience, so I encourage, again, audience participation. Having spent most of my career as an explosive ordnance disposal technician, having the honor and privilege to serve at various roles from the tactical, operational, and now strategic level, I can tell you that this interaction between scientists, researchers, industry professionals, and the warfighter, it's critical to helping combat not just our future threats, but emerging threats and new technologies. I look forward to our discussion today and encourage you guys again to ask questions and take advantage of the decades of experience that you have before you on stage. With that in mind, I'd like to take a moment to introduce our distinguished guests. I'd first like to start with Colonel Sean Kirshner, who is the Assistant Commandant at the U.S. Army Chemical, Biological, Radiological, and Nuclear School located in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. Sir?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me, Dr. Hand. Appreciate the invite back to the stage. This is my second time on a stage like this. I was in St. Louis, standing where Command Master Chief is, moderating the Ebola panel. So I've spent a lot of time in Dr. Hand's office doing Ebola. Since then, I was at Dugway Proving Ground as the commander out there, as the test and evaluation component of the Chem Biodefense program. And then the last 2 years I spent as the theater counter WMD officer for United States Forces Korea. 27 years CBRN officer, so glad to be here and look forward to having the discussion with you today.
All right. Thanks, sir. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. James Madsen. He's currently the lead clinical consultant and clinical laboratory director for the United States Army Medical Research Institute of Chemical Defense. Sir?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Ham. Thank you, everyone else. It has not escaped my notice that I'm the only one here not in uniform, but I do assure you, I spent 34 years in the U.S. Army, saw combat a couple of times, been deployed, and currently I am, as was stated, at the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Chemical Defense. I'm the token doctor on the panel. I'm board certified in anatomic and clinical pathology, occupational medicine, and medical toxicology.
All right, thanks, sir. Next, I'd like to introduce Chief Warrant Officer 2, Heather Hubbard, who is a CBRN Warrant Officer, Basic and Advanced Course Instructor at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. She additionally holds a PhD in Public Safety with specialization in Emergency Management. Ma'am?
Thank you. Prior to becoming the Warrant Officer Instructor for my cohort, my enlisted experience has been with the Army Evaluation and Testing Force, as well as the Future Forces Integration Directorate as the Senior NCO.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Next, I'd like to introduce Chief Master Sergeant Adam Womack, who is a Command Emergency Manager at Headquarters Pacific Air Forces. There, he provides direct mission support to the Commander, Pacific Air Forces, and Theater Joint Forces Air Component Commander on chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear defense and consequent management matters. Chief.
Hey, good afternoon and aloha. On behalf of my commander, the Commander of Pacific Air Forces, General Charles Brown, thank you for everything that you're doing. Our airmen today are operating in and through a complex and challenging CBRN environment, and they need to be organized, trained, and equipped to be able to do that effectively. And with your help, as one team, one fight going forward, we believe that we can deliver the capability that they need. And just lastly, if you could take one thing from me today, I would offer you this on behalf of the Commander of Pacific Air Forces. Use our area of responsibility to bring your ideas, your science, your technology directly to the warfighter today. We don't need the 100% solution. 70 to 80% works just fine. Please, open invitation to come out to the command and use our airmen to carry it forward. Thank you.
All right, so you heard of free trips to Hawaii there, so yeah, take them up on that, right? That's right. All right, next I'd like to introduce Master Gunnery Sergeant Gabriel Reese. He's the CBRN Chief at Headquarters Marine Corps Plans, Policies, and Operations, where he supports the development of countering weapons of mass destruction and CBRN defense policy and readiness.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. Just look forward to the discussion and look forward to using the technology we have here to try to provide some information however we can to shape and support your efforts in supporting us. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Master Guns. And finally, I'd like to introduce Lieutenant Colonel Michael Simpson, who currently serves as the Program Advisor to NGB, WMD Civil Support Teams. He also serves as the J39 LNO to the JPEO Chem Bio. Sir?
Thank you. Hope everyone had a pleasant lunch. If you're not familiar with the Northcom Chemical Response Enterprise, the Guard houses the domestic side of that capability. And so the focus of what I bring today will address the counter-WD aspects of the domestic warfighter. And we'll hopefully link into the other members of the panel here that are supporting the OCONUS mission. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So to start out our session this afternoon, I'd like to set the stage. For over a decade and a half, the United States has been involved in conflicts in the Middle East, conducting counterinsurgency and stability operations against terrorists, armed factions, near-peer nation states, and other proxies. The Defense Department has now begun to shift focus as directed by the National Defense Strategy from counterinsurgency operations towards preparations to dissuade conflict from competing peer and near-peer nation states. With this in mind, the first question that we have for our panel is this. Please describe the major changes you envision your service will need to make to adjust from the current fight to operating in a theater against a peer and near-peer rival and the anticipated impact that will have on chemical and biological defense. Sir?
Yeah, thanks. I'm not going to lie. I mean, I think over the last couple decades, we've been focused on the counterinsurgency fight, taking our eye off the ball a little bit on the counter-WMD CBRN defense. So now we're focused on large-scale combat operations against a near-peer or peer threat. One of the troublesome aspects of that is how do we maintain readiness while we modernize, and how do we absorb that modernization and keep pace with it, while being able to fight, tonight anywhere in the world. That said, since I've been a chemical officer, we've had three tenets. When I first came in, it was avoid, protect, and decontaminate. And over the last 27 years, those words have changed and morphed, but we're essentially the same. And today we're back to those three words, but we've changed avoid to assess, because maybe we don't want to avoid. Maybe we want to assess, and we have comfort knowing that our equipment will protect us good enough that we can maybe go and operate in that environment if we have to and take that advantage away from the enemy. So we've said assess. So we're really focused right now on how to assess. And a lot of that has to do with getting the man and the soldier, the sailor, airman, and marine out of the contamination. How do I sense deep? How do I do this autonomously with potentially unmanned aerial vehicles or unmanned ground vehicles, and mount the sensors on those things, put them in the contamination instead of the soldier? We're doing that right now with a sensor suite upgrade on our MBC reconnaissance vehicle. It's a striker-mounted platform, but we need to have a system that's agnostic to what ground platform it goes on. So it may not be a Striker tomorrow. It may be that next ground combat vehicle. But those sensors have got to look deep and operate deep, so we keep that man out of the contamination. The second thing, when we talk about protection, how do we protect, how do we reduce that thermal burden on our soldiers? Can we apply strippable coatings or absorptive coatings to our equipment and our vehicles to make it easier to decontaminate or mitigate that contamination? And so those are some of the things we're thinking about right now in fighting a large-scale combat operation against a near-peer threat versus the things we've been focused on the last 20 years. Finally, you know, when we talk about contamination mitigation, if we can't assess, avoid, and protect, contamination mitigation, how do we get away from a non-aqueous decon method? Is there, you know, high energy we can use, or some kind of robotics that we can use? How do we reduce that load on our soldiers to carry that much water and that kind of thing to mitigate the contamination when it does happen? So those are all the things that we at the Chem School, in partnership with JPO and GISTO and the test and evaluation community, are looking at right now on how to face this next multi-domain operations and large-scale combat operations. Anybody else?
Yeah, thank you for that, sir. Does anybody else care to comment on that?
Also along the same lines of our transition to assess, protect, and mitigate is the integration of early warning. With the transition to the new 3.0, we're going to have to be a much more mobile force than previously. So the integration of existing assets and the improvement of what we already have, as opposed to adding new things to have to carry and maintain and move and logistically resupply, better utilizing what exists. There's already information platforms and networks there. Using those more effectively so that we can become a more lethal, highly mobile force, I think is something that would be of great value for the integration of what we have.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Okay, any further comments? Our next question that we have here. Describe a CBRN-related situation where you as a staff officer had to inform a senior leader about a CBRNE situation and obtained a strategic decision. Please focus on the information fidelity level that was necessary for the leadership to make an informed decision. Sir, if you care.
Well, funny you should ask. My first combat experience is back in the Gulf War. I was a battalion surgeon to the 2nd 502 of the 101st Infantry Division in Saudi Arabia and Iraq. And we really thought that Saddam Hussein was going to use chemical warfare agents. So I trained my battalion. We learned how to decontaminate. We practiced. And at one point, the directive came down that we needed to give pyridostigmine bromide to all the soldiers. Now, you understand, pyridostigmine bromide is a pretreatment that's given to soldiers who are at high risk of being exposed to the nerve agent SOMAN or GD. And it's a command decision. It's not a medical decision. But hopefully there's input from medical staff, and in fact my battalion commander asked me for my input. Well, life is a series of making decisions based on inadequate data. We knew a lot about pyridostigmine. We didn't know everything about pyridostigmine. I knew from my medical training that there were some medical risks involved in giving this. So for instance, we had a steroid-dependent asthmatic in our battalion. So ahead of our giving this to everyone, I actually gave him a trial of that and was then able to report back to my battalion commander, yes, I've done this, it seems to work even in this individual without any side effects. So there were some clinical risks involved, but there are operational risks as well. How are soldiers going to react? And this is a risk that the commander has to bear. And it's a risk entailed in the idea that knowing what to do and knowing why you do it are two different things. It's easy to know what to do, take the pills. in this situation, I went around and I actually created some nerve agent graphics that I still use to explain how nerve agents work. I wrote them on the backs of butcher paper, and I tacked them up to the sides of field litter ambulances, and I went around to every one of the companies in our battalion. And I gave little lectures to the infantrymen, to the riflemen, on how nerve agents worked, how pyridostigmine was going to work, and the side effects that they could expect from that, especially urinary frequency and some diarrhea. So my soldiers were prepared. They knew not just what to do, but they knew what to do it. They knew why they were going to do it. It's interesting that the other 2 battalions in my brigade received the same instructions. Their commanders also had consulted with the battalion surgeons in those battalions and decided, yes, we are going to tell the soldiers to take this medication. They knew what to do. They took the pills. They didn't really know why they were doing it. And so the incidence of side effects in those other 2 battalions was alarmingly high, actually. People were seeing things, they were hallucinating, they thought they were being poisoned. Again, a simple thing, but what you tell your commander and what you have your commander authorize you to do for your troops can mitigate risks, not just of a medical sort, but also of an operational sort. So it was an interesting experience for me, where I in fact had to inform a senior leader, much senior to me, about the situation with pyridostigmine bromide and what the repercussions of that were.
Okay, thank you, sir. Yeah, thank you for that. Does anyone else have a story to add on that, where they engage with senior leaders or how to describe situations, whether on the field or prepare troops?
Sir, I'll take this one. I would offer not a story from my past, but really a fear and a concern going forward, that if we find ourselves, our airmen, and our joint warfighters in an environment where, no kidding, CBRN, weapons and/or materials are used. And I'll focus on warning and reporting. In the Pacific, we don't really have a body, an organization similar to NATO, where there's established standards for doing warning and reporting. In NATO, you have existing infrastructure. A lot of the warning and reporting systems that are delivered by the Joint Program Office and others out there are really designed based on those standards. But how do you do warning and reporting in an area of responsibility where you don't have dedicated infrastructure, where there's differences based on commander requirements of how we get that information up into the command channels so senior leaders can make that decision? So what I would ask and offer, again, hopefully you're coming out to Hawaii here soon, is the ability to design systems, information technology systems, that can provide a warning and reporting capability that is both designed for fixed site, in garrison, steady state, with dedicated infrastructure, but then also designed to operate in an expeditionary environment, in a non-permissive environment where you do not, most likely, have those types of dedicated communication infrastructure to support the warfighter. So again, that's the fear going forward, is if you've got to operate and do warning and reporting on pick an island in the middle of the Pacific, how do you do that? How do you get that information up into the hands of commanders who could make risk-based decisions given that information?
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Chief. Yeah. Any other comments on that particular question? Okay. So kind of moving on to emerging threats, I see here our next question up here. How do you see the role of AI in the future fight against CBRNE threats?
Take that.
Okay, sir.
Chief Hubbard mentioned integrated early warning, and coming from Korea, I know we're doing a real good job of doing that on a fixed site installation where we've got multiple sensors out there. They're all feeding a centralized common operating picture in an operations center somewhere, and then that's feeding into some decision support tools. What we don't do very well right now is get that on the move, mounted, expeditionary, as you just heard. How does that, AI could process all those sensors and the information coming from those sensors, the weather data that's required, the decision-making tools that could get the commander what he or she needs to make a decision very, very quickly. The speed of the battlefield of today and the future is just absolutely, it's the speed of war, we call it. It's very fast, and so in order to make those decisions, we've got to know how much information is enough to make that decision. And if we overanalyze it, we may miss our decision window. So you've got to give the commander that decision space and enough information with enough analysis to make that good decision. I think AI is probably where we need to go with that, because weather, terrain, forces on the battlefield, friendly forces, enemy forces, all that stuff could I see AI being an answer to helping the staff officer analyze that massive amount of information that is coming in from multiple sensors across multiple formations and potentially multiple partners. We may get into coalition partners and alliances here in a minute to tag on to what Chief Master Sergeant was talking about. But I think that's where AI can fit in a decision-making support role.
If you haven't heard the term multi-domain operations a dozen times yet in this conference, you will hear it later. And multi-domain operations does not mean that we look at operations in the air and on the sea and in land and undersea and in space, and we do all of that. It doesn't mean that. It means that we have strengths in one or two of those areas, and we try to leverage those strengths across the entire spectrum. AI is the natural way to do that.
I think there's still something to be said for the human component of it, as far as like contextual understanding and intuitive reasoning. So I think AI would be a decision support tool, but there still absolutely has to be the human element of what feels right, what this feels like. You don't realize how much you know until you've been that scared. So I see it as a tool, not necessarily the decision, but a support to your decision.
I appreciate that, ma'am. What's interesting about that too, each of our panelists talked about how we can utilize AI to aid the warfighter, and at the same time we have to think about the inverse on how potential peer or near peers will use AI against us to learn basically on the fly of what we're doing to counter them. So it's definitely an area where I think we're going to be spending a lot of time in the future taking a look at. Any other comments on that? Or?
Yeah, I'd just add one. So another element of AI and its role here within the Department of Defense and specifically the Air Force, it's not just about the fight. So I see the word fight in a lot of these questions. That kind of alludes to ride a boom, the proverbial boom, right? So an attack has happened and now we need AI to help process some level of information. But what ideally we'd like to see is the ability of AI integration with machine learning left of boom. So in the cooperation space below the threshold of war, so we can help shape and influence the operating environment, not only for the US, but with our partners and allies as well. So what does that look like? How can you leverage, for example, open source and take information, use machine learning, look at the algorithms, and produce an output that can help inform us earlier left of boom?
Thank you, Chief. Anybody else? Okay, kind of moving on to our next one. How would you increase synchronization between entities, e.g. Army Futures Command tasked with modernizing the fighting force and the CBDP? Care to comment on this one?
Well, I'm probably the best one to do that.
Yes, sir.
Army Futures Command obviously is our newest four-star command in the Army. They've pulled we operated along the domains of warfighting in TRADOC, Training Doctrine Command, of doctrine, organization, training, material, leadership, leader development. What did I miss? .mil-PF, personnel and facilities. It's an acronym you'll hear a lot when you're in my world. And Army Futures Command has taken material piece of that, and you know, we've dissected that .mil.pf, those domains throughout a couple different commands. And so I think it's very personality driven. I mean, you have to be aggressive about reaching out to your partners in the doctrine or in the organization or in the training domain or the material domain and build those relationships and bring that all together, because it doesn't work independently. If we're going to modernize materiel, there's a lot of doctrine and organization and training that's going to come with it. And so if those are disparate things operating at odds with each other, it's not going to come together and work. And so at the U.S. Army Chemical School, we have a .mil.pf integrator that works side by side with Army Futures Command, with the Maneuver Support Center and the Maneuver Center, with the doctrine folks and the material folks to bring it all together. So it's a work in progress. Army Futures Command is, like I said, I think it's less than a year old. So we're learning as we go, but it looks like their charter is to get the capabilities of the warfighter faster. And so again, it's diplomacy, it's guile, it's relationship building is really what it's looking like right now, in my world anyway. I'm not sure if anybody else on the panel has any AFC relationships, but I don't know.
We are part of AFC. MRICD is now the Medical Research and Development Command now is part of AFC. But I would say that question really ought to be expanded, because we're talking about synchronization between entities, and we are assuming that this is in the military. We're here because you guys are industry. How can you synchronize with us? How can we synchronize with you? And the most important thing that I can think of is that we don't have all the answers. We don't have all the bright ideas. We have some of them, but we don't have enough. But you do. And so what's really important for you is to come to us, come to Dr. Ham, come to DTRA, come to JPEO, come to the various organizations up here and say, look, I've got a wild and crazy idea that I think might work. It might be wild and crazy. It might not work, but it might. But if you don't tell us about it, we'll never know. So we need to synchronize not just between entities in the military, but between industry and the military, between industry and military-related organizations.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, sir. And I'll even go one step further. That when we look at this question, we have to look at not just what's in the U.S. and our own internal forces, but kind of some of the challenges of working with partner nations, with partner forces. If I could just add to this question for our panel here, have there been any challenges with working with partner nations, or are we seeing things emerging from our partners that we can further leverage, both in the science and technology or on the battlefield? Anyone care to comment on that?
So I've worked with ABCANs a very little bit, and some of the national caveats that fall more into the policy and political aspect of it have hindered a little bit of the progression. An example is the mask that we use. The first 5 classes of supply are designated by NATO. When we switch to a canister that clicks in as opposed to one that has specific sized rivets, we violated our own NATO standard. So we are no longer interoperable as far as filtration between entities. So if we're going to be in an environment like that, there's a lot of prior organization and planning, especially when it comes to logistics. Can I wear your MOP gear? Can you wear my MOP gear? What mask are we using? Whose prophylaxis? The national caveats and political policies have become a sticking point that, for the most part, we are still working through, but that was one of the issues that I came across when I was working with them.
Yes, ma'am. I think you bring up a very valid point that, as we project, if there are future conflicts that we're going to be working by with and through our partners, it's critical that our folks on the battlefield have gear and equipment that are synonymous across those forces in case we get a share or there's a shortfall or just the training aspect that goes with that. So I think kind of coming from industry as we look at not just good, what's good for us, but but seeing what technology and everything is out there for our partners as well. Sir, did you have anything to add to that, or if anybody else would care to add to this?
No, I agree. I mean, we're never going to fight alone. We never have fought alone. We're never going to fight alone. But a lot of times we find ourselves in charge in a lot of these conflicts around the world. And, you know, I'll tack on to what Chief said a minute ago. The warning and reporting and sharing information among coalition partners. So I'll take Korea, for example. In the Korean War, I think there was 26 United Nations partners that came onto the peninsula to fight the Korean War in the 1950 to 53. So that's probably going to happen again. A lot of those partners we do train with periodically, but they're not consistently on the pen in exercises. So when they come to the pen, it's probably going to be because there's a conflict going on. And so they're not going to have time to learn a warning and reporting system to feed that common operating picture for the commander. That commander is going to need to know where hazards are, where those no-go areas are, where those downwind hazards are. And the United States is going to be a fraction of the total force that's out there feeding that common operating picture. So if we don't have something to offer our coalition partners that's intuitive, that's probably cloud-based, that's, you know, on a common command and control network so that everybody can see it and have real-time situational awareness of the hazards that are out there, it's not going to work. You know, so, you know, it's 2019. When's the last time you downloaded an app on your phone and looked at the instructions for the app? You haven't, because they're all intuitive. Why can't we do the same thing for our CBRN information system that we deploy in whatever theater we go? And say, here, partner, this is multilingual. You know, you just plug it into the network of whatever command network we're using, and have your CBRN people input the hazards that you encounter on the battlefield so that everybody can see it real time. I think that's something that really could use some work and help.
Okay, thank you for that, sir. Anybody else care to comment on international partners?
I will say something just regarding what Dr. Madsen had mentioned between us and the collaboration or the synchronization with your efforts in the S&T community. A lot of times the ideas in the S&T community, they might not be popular or they might not be sort of mainstream. And just from personal experience, there seems to be a hesitation sometimes to bring that idea forward just because it's not popular or because it's sort of outside of the box, to tie it to this morning's brief. And I would just encourage, especially when dealing with the different service members, bring those ideas out that seem a little bit outside of the box, especially as the generational shift starts to take place. A lot of the outside of the box thinkers, and I hate to use the cliche, but a lot of those ideas people aren't thinking about, and people aren't really looking at it outside of the view that they have. So sometimes just getting a prompt or a cue from an S&T manager or from one of the providers, it gives you an idea to be able to walk away from. And you might not have a real takeaway right then, but as you're driving down the long road of I-95 on the way home, sometimes it gives you time to think about things and see how that idea that seemed a little off can sort of mature as you have a little bit more time to think about. So I just encourage you to bring up those ideas so that we can move forward with them and start thinking about how they can really apply to the battlefield and how they can be employed.
No, I appreciate that, Master Guns. Thank you. Before we get off the topic of kind of international partners, anybody else care to add anything? Okay, so I think that kind of moves in nicely to our next question here. So what are some of the challenges in maintaining equipment and operator readiness, and I'll add in training to that as well, especially in regards to National Guard or Reserve units, and let's open up the aperture a little bit more to just kind of any unit as well. Anybody care to comment on that? Sir, I see you shaking your head.
So I'll take the lead on the initial one for the Guard units. So in answering this question, we have to delineate this into the two overarching groups. We have the Chemical Response Force, which is part of the National Guard, and then we have General Purpose Forces. For the chemical response entities, such as the SERFs and the HERF-Ps, I would offer up that we don't necessarily have a maintenance or a training problem outright. What we do have is reality. Just like a fire department or a police department, we have 22 people on a team each one of those highly specialized. And so when one leaves, you are, in essence, left with some void, right? So you get at that by cross-training, you get at that by sharing diversity and responsibilities. But at the end of the day, right, when you don't have your A game, you're hopeful that you can at least cover that battle space with the Delta. As it relates to equipment, again, we don't really have problems with maintaining our equipment. What we do have is, again, a sense of reality, right? Because this is all taxpayer-funded equipment that we all own and employ. The basic of issue is that sometimes when a critical system goes down, that is the one and the only one of those pieces of equipment. And then in the domestic threat, right, you don't know when the threat is coming at you. And so we have to be ready 24/7, 365. So just like anything, you find that on that day, some piece of equipment may not be 100% functional, and that's when you get a response. And so you, again, as again you mentioned, you sort of have to, be creative, think outside the box, look at what other pieces of technology do I have that cross that battle space. Kind of looking into that toolbox and saying, this isn't the perfect hammer, but this is good enough to whack it and get what I need, right, is to confirm or deny, feed some information processing decision-making for the leaders. Lastly, socializing this question earlier, for the traditional guard structure, right, because these individuals, are not on site every day. You get at this by, command discipline, by structuring those programs and prioritizing those pieces of equipment that you cannot support, and then leveraging other assets in the state to have a cover down on those when they're on their active duty cycles. So, thank you.
All right, thank you, sir. On that topic, anybody else care to comment? In regards to operator readiness, training? Okay.
Well, you want to bring up training?
Yeah, training, sir. Training. All right, let's go to training.
All right, well, I'll go to training. It doesn't say it. I'll take training. For the last several years, we've been, again, focused on coin, and that threat's been a lot different. It's been a lot of times clandestine, small pilot scale, experimental targets that we've seen our enemies in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria. But when you go to, I keep reverting back to Korea because it's fresh in my mind because that's where I spent the last couple of years, where you got a near-peer threat with a robust, mature, industrial, state-sponsored WMD program. The training is all different. And so if you expect our soldiers to walk into a chemical production facility or a biological production facility or an enrichment, uranium enrichment or nuclear reprocessing facility and know what they're looking at and where to take the sample and where to take the pictures and how to characterize it and confirm what it is and do whatever exploitation we need to have our training base ready to train them to do that. The comfort zone is to go back to the Breaking Bad chemistry set on a table and basic distillation, function going on or whatever like that. But, how do we train our soldiers to do that state-sponsored industrial-sized complex? How do we train them to characterize that? I think it's cost prohibitive to try to build that kind of stuff. There are certain places. Korea has a couple. We've made a good attempt at doing that, both on the Korean side and the U.S. side in Korea. Dugway Proving Ground has a couple facilities where we have world-class training out there. But it's not realistic to think that we're going to be able to build those kind of facilities at a lot of installations that do training. I propose that synthetic training environment is where it's at with AR and VR. And we can model what they will look like and have our soldiers doing reps and sets over and over again on, potentially real-world targets that we know are out there. So before they ever set foot on the ground, they know where to enter and what they should expect when they walk inside of it. And where they should be taking the pictures or shutting it down or whatever they're going to do. But so I think there's a lot of room for synthetic training environment development in our space. It's easy to talk about how to fly a helicopter in a simulator or driving a ground combat vehicle, but in our space, that's where I think we need to take AR and VR training for what it's worth.
Yeah. Okay, appreciate that, sir. Anybody else
Could I add
on
just
training?
to the end, to the gentleman's comments on the training? For the longest time, the DoD looks at training as a critical asset to prepare, for engagements. What I would offer up, right, is that training is this part of that solution equation, if you will, right? once you're going to adopt a training, you have to follow up with refresher training. You have to check that training and ensure that it's being, performed and conducted, and you have to find that regularity, whatever that is. Is it bi-weekly? Is it once a year? Right? So when you go after that front end of training, you're basically committing yourself to something on the back end. And when you add that back end, you also have to take into consideration all the other things that our warfighters are tasked with understanding on a day-to-day basis. There's usually some annual training that a unit's called to do. And so if you're not doing, sharp training, if you're not doing, some other attribute of, warfighter-driven training, the more we add to that front-end portfolio, it sounds great. But if you can't execute it, it's just great talk. Right?
I'd like to add too, so our Chief Master Sergeant of the Air Force, Ryan, always talks about you don't have to get a home run everything that you do. Sometimes the singles work just fine. And as those singles add up, you become pretty powerful in terms of success. And so I had the pleasure of walking through the room here beside us and looking at many of you, your companies have posters hanging up on the bulletin boards out there. And I would say that each one of those are probably a single. When we talk about training, I think it's more than just training, it's about education. And so how do we get all the great work that you're doing, that you've communicated on those boards, out into the hands of the airman and the warfighter? That's pretty powerful for them to be able to have that level of insight and understanding of what you're doing as part of industry. Because I can tell you right now that the majority of the airmen in my AOR are wondering each and every day, what is big U.S. government, what is the industry doing to advance these capabilities, to take it to the next level? Many of us have children, and I can tell you that children today, they are questioning what we are doing, why we are doing it, and they are looking for new, innovative ways of doing business. I think that's unprecedented in our time, and so I would ask that we leverage the opportunities that you're creating to help spread that information through education, deliberate development, partnership, mentorship, and if we need to take a couple airmen and put them in your locations for a month or two and try to get immersed in what it is that you're doing so they can bring that back out, I think that's something, that's an incredible opportunity we can look into. So bottom line, it's not just about training, it's about education. We're just simply not aware of all the great, extraordinary things that you guys are doing. So thank you.
Right, and I couldn't agree more with the chief. Sometimes we use education and training in ways that sound intuitive to us but are not necessarily clear to everybody else. In my mind, education is conveying information didactically. You tell somebody something and you convey information. Training, in my mind, is conveying hand skills, helping people to do things with their hands and with their bodies. To maintain equipment and to train operators, you need both. You need education to give them a foundation, to help them understand what they're doing with their hands. You have to educate them so that they understand why it's important. But you also need, and you can, AI certainly, virtual education is incredibly important with that too. But there's nothing that substitutes for hands-on training to say, here's the equipment, hold it in your hand, this is how you unscrew this is what you do. Now, you can aid that with virtual instruction as well, and you, I think, do that at the CBRN School, and we certainly do that at USAM or ICD. But both are important. I'm glad you brought up the education part of that, and you brought up the virtual part.
I would also say that our reliance on contract support has also resulted in some challenges. The DERSCO with the DRSKO, with the resupply challenges that we have and the costs of sustainment, the training not only has to come at net fielding, but it has to be continuous. It needs to be sequential and progressive. So you can't teach someone something once and then let it be. That can't be the only time they feel it, touch it, maybe even break it a time or two. It has to be a continuous process, and that costs time and money. But the training needs to be sequential and progressive. It has to get harder, and it can't just be a one-time, look, you have this, it's great. Now move on to something else.
Right, we see that now, right? When you see through new equipment training, everyone that's at that training sort of gets a picture of what that was fielded for and understands basically for that given point in time. As those people transition and as the years become weeks and months and days and such, years, you migrate through soldiers, and so you get to that point where that private or that airman or soldier doesn't necessarily understand why they have the piece of technology. They just know that they have it, and so then they're probably missing a capability set of how that would have been employed from the original design of the capability gap. And so to everyone's point, right, the sustaining of that training from day one all the way through the life cycle of the piece of technology is pretty important.
Thanks, sir. Any other?
I'd also add the training, employment training is sort of what I'll suggest that they were referring to, not to exclude anything, but I would also add that training for maintaining equipment is valuable as well. I think across the board, the service members recognize that we're asking for a lot with some of these capabilities that we have, especially on the detection and identification side. And with a lot that we're asking for, we realize that there's a lot of nuanced maintenance details that maybe the average guy or gal, at least in the Marine Corps, isn't privy to or isn't going to be able to sustain on a regular basis to be able to keep that piece of equipment up and running. To sort of add to what the Chief Warrant Officer referenced, within the Marine Corps, when you hand a piece of gear out, there will be more breakage. It will likely be more than once or twice. So having those maintaining the maintenance capabilities, they're resident at the unit with the people that are actually going to take that equipment and deploy with it, versus having to send it back to a manufacturer or having to send it back to a company, so that specialized instruments and training is required to be able to maintain it. That's something that, at least for the Marine Corps, we've looked at numerous times to try to really carve out what is required from a maintenance standpoint, just to be able to use that in the evaluation process of an end item, because that is a big concern. Make sure we have not only the ability to employ the item, but also to maintain it when the need comes up.
I appreciate that perspective, Master Guns. I mean, it's something to keep in mind that the more complicated piece of equipment it is, the more likely or more prone it could be to breaking. And then, in the adage of one is none, two is one, if the scale of it or the expense of it is preventative, a warfighter could quickly find himself without a capability. It might be the gold standard, but if he can't get it to work, or if it's malfunctioning and he has to ship it back from overseas, it becomes problematic real quickly. So I think to go with that training question, the next question that we have teed up here kind of continues along that train of thought. So what is your biggest capability gap, and what steps are you taking to close the gap to maintain a lethal force? So I guess to the audience, what do we see as a capability gap? What do we wish that we had that we're seeing something coming down the pipe that we don't feel that we're prepared for?
So I can kind of share the airman's perspective on this one in Pacific Air Forces. So we have to become light, lean, agile. You have to be able to do that so we can operate both in and through the operating environment. Today, just for Air Force CBRN specialists, the equipment packages that we have with all of our detection devices, decon, et cetera, weighs roughly about 10.3 short tons. Costs over $6 million just for one location. So if I've got to take that heavy package today that takes probably 22 plus airmen to be able to go operate and employ for CBRN consequence management, how do I take that and put that on an aircraft and deliver it to some other austere expeditionary type location? And so for us, it's all about getting lighter, leaner, more agile, taking the technology through UAVs, ground vehicle platforms, robotics, integrated sensors, networks, taking all that together and packaging it in a very small footprint. Small as in a single Polaris Ranger type footprint that can support self-sustaining 4 airmen for 1 day to 14 days to 30 days. What does that look like? And so for us in PACAF, that's what we're trying to work with DTRA and others to conceptualize, to finally, once and for all, get us that light lean capability that we need as part of that lethal force.
Chief, I think you bring a great perspective that, when we talk about future conflicts and operating in an environment where we don't own the battle space, we can't bring the kitchen sink like we're used to these days, right? Where we can have a large footprint and we can bring everything that we want. Smaller, lighter, faster, more maneuverable is going to be critical to having a fielded capability that's viable in future conflicts. So appreciate that. Does anybody else have a comment on capability gaps or something that they're seeing from where they're sitting? Okay.
Well, I mean, I hit decon earlier. I'll just keep hitting it because it's bothered me for my career because it hasn't really changed much since 1950. So we are looking for that next leap, not an incremental change in technology, but what's the next leap? What's that non-aqueous solution that we can count on that's going to do a good job at knocking down the contamination to levels that we can operate safely in? It's something that we're really focused on, and at this point we're looking at it says what are we doing right now. One of the things we're doing is we've got a disclosure spray that you spray the vehicle or the piece of equipment with this disclosure spray, and it tells you exactly where the contamination is, so you can focus your efforts, so you don't need as much water. So that's one of the ways we're doing it, but obviously we've talked about pixie dust for many, many years. Where's that pixie dust that's going to do the job for us? Is it out there? Have we reached that horizon on the technology side that we can figure that out? If so, please get your yellow sticky notes up here quick, because we've been looking for that for a long time.
I think the scalability of decon is something else that we can improve on. Instead of deconning a truck or a couple people at a time, can we decon a city? Can we do terrain decon? And while the M12 is great, we've had that since like the 50s or 60s. I mean, if you did it right the first time, leave it alone, that's fine. But how big is big enough? Not just the piece of equipment, like how big can I decon at a time? Can I decon this whole room? Can I do this half and then that half? How big can I go?
And related to that question is not just how big is big enough, but how clean is clean? How many molecules can you tolerate still being there after you have done all that you can to mitigate the contamination? I think in some ways shifting our focus from contamination removal to contamination mitigation and removing all that we need to and then tolerating the rest is a worthy goal.
That also goes back to one of the national caveats that I spoke of earlier for contamination of human remains, or even just someone that's been injured. How clean is clean enough to go into a hospital? What are you going to do with that person? If you can't save them, how do you dispose or inter that body? Different nations have different policies and legal aspects that they have to take into consideration, but it all goes back to how much is enough? How clean is clean?
But you realize that's a dead issue.
Dead? Thank you, sir. Thank you.
So I would add to that, right, because I see this happen numerous times within the requirements process, is when you ask the question, what's clean enough? Typically it gets to what is the most sensitive capability that one can employ. But when you talk about that type of technology or that type of process, all too often as we harden that, right, to deliver to the warfighter, you lose that sensitivity level, that delta. And a lot of our reference materials, right, are driven off of, we don't really use, PELs and STELs when you're in theater, you use AGLs and such, right? Those are driven off of a time exposure, right? So standing on the battlefield for that 15 minutes initially, right, is completely different than my elements, right, where we're gonna turn back over a school and we're gonna let your children occupy it, right? So the concept of clean enough is dependent upon who you're asking. It's no different than saying, what do you want for dinner, right? You're going to get 70 different answers probably from this room. And so you have to really take it into the construct on what you're really, looking at. And it can even be different with a maneuver force, right? Is, the capabilities of that heavy brigade, right? And the ability to resupply themselves over time and space with the logistics attributes could be completely different than a small tactical element that's basically on their own, operating, in an auspicious environment. And so, you have to be very pinpointed when you ask the question of how good is good enough, because then that drives, right, how much money are you willing to throw at the technology, right? Are we talking about something that costs $400,000? Or are you talking about something that's a color metric that you could probably manufacture for 50 cents on the dollar and such? So it's a very complex question.
There's one corollary to this. I'm looking at the question. It says, what's your biggest capability gap? It reminds me that when I deal with industry, industry is really big on saying, we've just developed something that is capable of doing such and such. Here's a diagnostic device that can do such and such. But having that capability isn't enough. You have to have a concept of employment. You have to have a concept of operations. So just to say we can do this doesn't mean much if you don't know your customer well enough to be able to answer the question, well, who needs it? Who wants this to be done? Or in what settings will this be done? And that answer depends on whether you're far forward or back a little bit or back in CONUS. So the answer is that, but when you develop something that has a certain capability, advertise that capability, but also work from the very beginning to say, how is that capability going to be used? What's the concept of employment?
So I'll add on to that, give you hopefully an example that resonates with the majority in the room. So one of our most effective detectors today is M8 paper. So at a given installation, you're going to put out over 343 pieces of M8 paper around the installation at operationally relevant locations. You're going to do that by going to Home Depot or your local hardware store and buying over 300 wooden stanchions that you're going to put together so you can sit out these pieces of M8 paper all across the airbase, with the idea that if an adversary would launch a TBM, tactical ballistic missile, at the installation, and their warhead would be detonating at an airburst around 250 meters, that agent deposition would fall on the airbase and this M8 paper would collect that agent, and that would be an indication that you were attacked with said chemical agent. That's the most effective capability that we have today employed at air bases to get liquid deposition. So think about that. A capability that's been around for decades is still our most reliable capability. So that's an opportunity, I think, rather than a gap. To me, it's an opportunity where I think there's a lot of smart people out there that can figure out a way probably to design and develop something similar that can collect liquid deposition from an airburst chemical warhead to provide that early indications and warning that something has happened. So I would, for our airmen's perspective, I would much rather seize technology, innovation to drive towards something that's more in the 2000s versus something that's from many decades ago.
No, thank you for that, Chief. Any other comments on that, on capabilities? Okay, well, that kind of plays into our next one then as well. So next question here, and after this question, I'm going to take a pause and actually open it up to the audience. So you'll see that you have 2 microphones out there as well. So we're a little more than halfway through our session. So if somebody has that burning question, maybe you can't get Slido to work or something, I will give you an opportunity to stand before the mic if you feel like doing so. So answering our next question here, with recent years more focus on counterinsurgency, how do we intend to accelerate our understanding of complex CBRN challenges and or improve our capabilities? We talked about the capability gap. How are we broadening our understanding here? What are we doing to get after it?
Well, so maybe I'll throw one out. Oh, go ahead, please.
I'd say there's a multitude of ways. One consideration is to really break down who needs to understand and for what reason. An individual Marine or individual service member might need a certain level of understanding in order to protect himself or herself. A commander or a higher headquarters staff officer may need a completely different level of understanding to be able to shape the next maneuver, or the next fire mission, whatever that action is. So really trying to tie in what decisions need to be made and how an understanding of that CBRN environment can influence that decision, I think is a good starting point in some cases, simply because it allows the collaboration between the warfighters and the S&T community, as well as within the organizations themselves, to be able to really start having a discussion on who needs to know what information and what becomes too much. I think that was referenced earlier with artificial intelligence, and what is that right sweet spot of information to be able to provide an understanding to enable you to do what you have to do right then. And the right then and what it is you have to do is just inherently in a military organization is going to change depending on what formation and echelon you're at.
All right, thank you, Master Guns. Anybody else care to comment on this one?
I would just say that, so this problem set isn't new, right? It's been around for way longer than I've been around. I just think that over the last 2 decades, we focused a lot of our efforts, like the question alludes to counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. And so within the military, Air Force specifically, as we've turned over manpower, 80% of the airmen in today's military never actually experienced the type of dedicated, institutionalized CBRN defense training platform program that existed 20 years ago. And so as we reorient back towards being more ready, lethal warfighters, airmen in this case, I think we've got to figure out a way to reinstitutionalize the science that's out there behind chem-bio defense. A lot of testing, a lot of hard work from our predecessors took place years ago, and it's out there somewhere on some CD-ROM or floppy disk or whatever you want to call it. It's there, but we need your help bringing back that information that's residing out there somewhere, bringing it back, putting life back into it, and then sharing that in a capacity that, whether it's a peer review or something similar, but sharing that information and sharing your perspective on how we intend to do counter CBRN operations going forward.
I think that is absolutely spot on. If you understand the theory of operation and the science behind something, then all the versions and additions and different kinds of buttonology that come out for it, you can work through that because you understand what is happening inside that piece. Not only that, but you can better articulate the answers and the responses to a combatant commander. It spits out a 7. Okay, what does 7 mean? You'll be able to intelligently articulate in words and ways that matter to them what it is. Why do you care about this? So I absolutely think bringing back the science and the theory of operation within our technical capacity that's great.
It's a game changer.
Yeah, it is.
No, thank you, man.
I would offer up too that I think we do a pretty decent job linking combat developers, right, with the tactical warfighters to try to get at the itch. But what I think that we really fail to do, though, right, and you know, I used to be a 11 Bravo infantry a long time ago, and the thing that I learned, right, is that every piece of technology we have is to drive a decision. Even a weapon is a decision-making tool. What I mean by that is that we close the gap with the warfighter, but we never bring it back to the senior leaders to drive, did this actually deliver the decision-making tool that you need? I've seen a lot of operational tests constructed over the last 5 years, and I have never seen where the senior leadership was part of the decision-making of that test. We took a soldier, we asked, can you employ this widget? Can you get a dedicated output, i.e. if we challenge the system with, let's say, VX, can you detect VX? I see that happening all the time, but never once did I see where that was presented to the senior leaders to say, okay, present it to you in this format. Does this give you what you need to make that tactical decision, right, to execute left or right? And so as it gets at, you know, how are we improving our capabilities, right? You know, one of the facets of the military is to train you the way you fight, right? But we don't test the way we fight. We sort of get at it and we go a risk reduction strategy because we can't really take a soldier and put him in a VX environment, so we have to sort of ad lib from it. But in doing so, we miss those tactical, actually those strategic level, operational level outputs that are fed from the tactical. You can give the soldier the widget, but if the widget's not making the commander happy, you're just spinning your wheels.
Yeah, thanks, sir.
Something
Sir?
something that we haven't talked about yet. You know, unfortunately, human beings will probably continue to try to find more wicked ways to utilize chemical and biological weapons against each other, as you know, as history has shown. So, you know, a complex CBRN challenge is, you know, what's next? What's that next generation agent that's synthetically modified, whatever? And how are we going to prevent that surprise from happening? How are we going to be able to detect it? How are we going to be able to protect against it? How are we going to be able to counter it with, you know, within our physiological system? So, you know, obviously something we probably need to take into a more classified setting to talk about in detail, but it's out there, and we can't lose sight of that, even though, you know, most countries in the world have signed on to some treaty or other saying they're not going to do this. Well, some of those countries are working today to work around those treaties and say, have some, deniability to say, I'm still abiding by the treaty. Well, you're working on this thing over here. Well, that doesn't, the treaty doesn't cover that, so I'm okay. Well, so that's going on out there. Don't fool yourself, but I think it's something we got to keep our eye on so we don't get surprised in the future.
That's a very valid point, sir, and probably just to piggyback that too is going on to the next question. I see there's some interest in this one, is the false positives with technology. With sensors out there, getting false positives or saturating the systems, and the warfighter doesn't know if it's a valid threat, if it's not, and then once he derives that it is a valid threat, are the networks fast enough to be actionable? So again, I'll just read the question. Advent of deepfake technology, how do you ensure trustworthy information is derived from sensor networks fast enough to be actionable? From a warfighter perspective, how concerned are we with this? And then really, this is a question for industry too. What level of fidelity is the equipment providing so that our warfighters aren't getting false positives or steering them in a wrong direction?
Well, I think of the X-Files. When all else fails, think of the X-Files. The truth is out there, but trust no one. There are always going to be false positives and false negatives from any kind of a test, any kind of a sensor. And as I mentioned before, life is the business of making decisions based on inadequate or potentially unreliable data. So if you're in a decision-making role and you have the time to get something from a sensor network and then say, well, can I verify that another way? Obviously, the more verification, the more separate pieces of evidence that you have, the more confidence you have in that initial report. But if things are happening at a blinding speed and you've got to make really fast decisions and you've only got one sensor network available and it's saying, oop, red light, you've got this kind of a threat, you have to, people who make decisions, and people in the military know this, people make decisions based on a certain amount of risk. You say, I'm making a decision, I'm not completely confident that the input that I'm getting is reliable, but I have to make the decision, and so you make the decision. And you try to make a decision that does the least amount of harm while still trying to mitigate the threat as well as you can. Nothing's going to be foolproof. So I don't think we should expect ourselves to be completely invulnerable to deep fake technology. We will always get misleading reports from our sensors, even when they're not being faked out. It's a question of how you evaluate that information and just realizing that you need, at some point, you need to make a decision whether you're fully confident or not in what the sensors say.
Right. I would offer up, right, that a counter strategy for the U.S. government, right, to the advent of false or cross reactivity, right, is to be adamantly trained to operate in the battle space in a chem bio posture, right? I think if we fool ourselves and we're reliant upon technology, right, when an adversary decides to throw out a purposeful simulant, if you will, to put you into that chemical ensemble. If you're effective as a warfighter in that ensemble because you train in it and you live in it and you're practiced to go into that threat, as opposed to you haven't tried it on for a year and a half and you're kind of like, I hope I can stay in it for an hour, right? So I think that the key is to be able to leverage your own weakness. Know that if it does have those sensitivity issues where there is a false positive, you have the counter and the ability to flip that to a positive for yourself, right? I think that the enemies, right, don't train in those ensembles, and even though we won't employ chemical weapons, right, there's still some battle space maneuvering in there. And then lastly, to the, from a piece of technology, if the requirements are written very well, right, those metrics that drive success should be incorporated in there. And if the flash to bang time, i.e. is it quick enough, that's always been in most of the documents that I've seen, right, as a KPP or a KSA, is something that says that it's got to be able to do it in this amount of time. And if it doesn't, there's some risk buffer that I'm willing to accept, right? Is good enough what we have today good enough? And so I think the last one is sort of being answered, but if the individual's context was in relation to the false positives, then to Dr. Madsen's, I think that we understand, and we get at it by having about 8 simulants and interferences the government always tests their technology on to ensure that those don't operate in a false positive. So I think we try to get at it.
Yeah, just to add on that, the false positives are always going to be a challenge. Even going back to the M8 paper and everything, right? There's simulants that will set that off. And just as a warfighter, again, the folks in the field have to make timely decisions, and they make it based on the best information that they have. If they go down the road of a false positive, it's tremendous resources on that unit. They're masking up, they're breaking out that war reserve kit and everything. And if it's a false positive, that just degrades their ability for if there's a true threat the next time. So I'm gonna pause here because we're about 20 minutes left, and I see the next question. I don't want to give a self plug since I'm the only DTRA agent up here, so I promise you I did not put that in there. But I definitely want feedback on there. But I do want to open up for anybody in the audience that wants to step up to the mic or maybe has a question that hasn't made it up to the Slido queue, kind of a burning desire that you'd like to ask our folks up here. So anybody out there?
Yeah, for the panel, first of all, I wanted to say thanks for your time and your discussions here. I think I've talked to each one of you other than the Chief Warrant Officer in person. But my question is, geographical combatant commanders that are assuming this risk that we all are dealing with, how are you as service reps communicating or taking back those operational risks? We've often seen that we look at things from a programmatic risk perspective and not an operational risk perspective. So how are you linked into the combatant command's plans and how they plan to execute in the risk that they're assuming?
Okay, thanks, sir. Anybody care to take that one?
I'll take a stab at it. So appreciate the question, sir. I think that's an area that we could use everyone's help on. So there's joint risk analysis. There's a lot of joint risk assessment methodologies that are out there all across DoD. But I don't think that we've ever looked holistically at the Chem Bio Defense program and developed a way to measure those risks associated with the gaps that occur. So if I've got a gap in, let's say, collective protection, I can guess that X amount of airmen warfighters won't be protected. They're going to have to rely on their individual protective equipment, their mask, their suit, rather than going into a collective protection facility and getting out of that gear. But I don't know what the associated risk is for that. How long? By adding collective protection back into the portfolio, how does that buy down the risk? So I guess bottom line key takeaway is we could really use industry's help in developing very CBRN-centric measures for risk, especially operational risk.
We jokingly tell our lieutenants that are coming up through our bullet classes, don't be nerdy, Chemo. It's just, there's so much information, you can't tell a combatant commander, everything that you know. It's overflow, it's too much. They'll tune you out after a while, it's just too detailed. But you do always have to convey the risks. Sometimes they just want to know, am I going to die, and how fast do I have to go through there? How bad is it? How quickly do I have to move? Can I be there? If I do have to stay there, what are the risks? You always have to convey the risks, and I completely agree that metrics of risk, especially when it comes to CBRN, are something that we definitely need.
I will say that one of the recent developments in this area, as far as assessing operational risk, comes in the form of casualty estimation. Planners, commanders need to know what the risk is and how many casualties do I think I will incur. Up until recently, that's not been a very precise operation for CBRN. People in the past have said, well, you think you've got so many casualties from conventional injuries. If it's CBRN involved, just multiply it by 3. Well, that may be in the ballpark, but it's not nearly good enough. The good news is that I think it's been approved now, it's supposed to have been approved sometime in November. There is a tool called the Joint Medical Planning Tool. And there are a couple of components to that. And very recently, a CBRNE element, certainly a chemical element, was added to that. And my understanding is that it's been approved at the highest levels and will be added to the Joint Medical Planning Tool that will help commanders assess and planners assess the operational risk, at least from the chemical part. And biological and radiological is coming in the next few years.
I think one of the biggest problems is that we don't incorporate the true complexity of CBRN into our exercises, especially at the higher levels. You go to some of these exercises, there's a chemical strike, you move the decon icon over it, and an hour later it's gone. And we teach bad habits that way to 3- and 4-star generals. And so I think it's incumbent on our community to force the training community to incorporate the complexity into the exercises to truly replicate what would actually happen. It's not the grid square that's contaminated. It's this. It's the way the weather took it. And there are routes around it and through it and stuff. But it's going to take time for me to assess that with my reconnaissance vehicles and my unmanned aerial ground vehicles, you know. But once you give me that time, boss, to assess it, then I can get you around it. You don't have to go through that grid square potentially. So I think we need to step back and put a lot more effort into our exercises to bring that reality and that complexity into the exercises and force the 3- and 4-star to say, yes, your other training objective may not get across this time, but let's put this training objective first and foremost in this one, potentially, okay, if that's what keeps you up at night, because you keep saying that. And then there are things like CAMCO, Combined Arms Maneuver in a Contaminated Operating Environment, which was a tabletop dedicated to the complexity of this, which, you know, we've got this, you know, an exom or a, you know, a out report that's very comprehensive that really conveys that risk. And we've taken that and really dissecting that, or the MAGTF TOCX we did, you know, those kinds of things, where it's focused on that complexity. But the problem is with those, they're in our niche community. What we need to do is incorporate it into those 3- and 4-star theater level, core level exercises so that those 2s, 3s, and 4 stars can see it and understand it and start incorporating it into their reporting mechanisms that Chief talked about a minute ago.
To paraphrase Einstein, things should be kept as simple as possible, but not simpler.
Right.
Thanks, sir. Okay, I'll open up the mic again. Anybody else have a question from the floor that you'd like to present from the mic?
Yeah, thank you for your insights. I was wondering, one of the backlogs or traffic jams that I see between future tech and scaling to an enterprise is procurement pathways. And I wondered if there's any recommendations that you guys had, as well as when you look at S&T as a broad spectrum, is there any focus or technology that you focus for the next generation of students, whether it be like quantum chemistry or synthetic biology, that would advance your own efforts?
Okay, thanks, sir.
So I don't think you'll solve the problem with procurement streams. That's always been a challenge for the government, you know, especially because we have to be compliant, you know, to the ethical and moral standards that, you know, are imposed upon the government. The thing that could potentially help the procurement streams is to be realistic with the true basic of issue that's part of the technology you're going after. Right, I don't know if you've perhaps seen it, but I've seen where we've had, you know, a requirement for, let's say, you know, 10,000 systems across the DoD spectrum, but then when we look, the services can't support them, or there's not enough money in the POM to support it, right? So we cut it and we whittle away at that to get it down. But in getting it down, you're not really addressing, though, are those procurement streams still legitimate, especially if they're based on a procurement size of order. And so I think one of the things with the procurement is you just have to be realistic with the quantities and the time expectations that you're trying to deliver.
I'll tell you one of the things I'd like to see. from a medical perspective. We have a test to test for cholinesterase activity in the body, and that's a marker for nerve agent exposure. Well, there is a laboratory test that will do that, but it takes time and it takes training, and the footprint is fairly large. Well, a while ago, somebody working in his garage in a basement developed a thing that was called TestMate, which is a much smaller kit, which can give you an answer a lot more quickly, but it still requires some training. We're working right now on a monitor that is essentially like a glucose monitor. It takes a little strip, so you just do a finger stick and you put that onto the strip, and within a few seconds you get an answer. That's a good step, but I would like to see wearable technology. I'd like to see something that could be worn and maybe have microneedles that go inside the body, inside the interstitium of the skin, and can sample and then can maybe transmit, so that you don't have to break the barrier of a glove. You don't have to take off a glove, or you don't have to break the barrier of your personal protective equipment to get a specimen. I'd like to see that sort of thing. That's on my wish list.
Thanks, sir.
I would say for the procurement side, it's got to be timely, it's got to be relevant. A lot of the chem biodetection technologies that are out there, we've been pursuing for, we started procurement fielding 10, 15 years ago, and we're just now getting to a point where that life cycle is complete, and now the airmen have the full up capability that we promised them a decade ago. So I think as we go down this track collectively, whatever is produced, it has to be affordable, but it has to be timely and has to be relevant. I can't put a capability in the airmen's hands that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, is going to be completely outdated because of the evolution of the threat. So there's a little price you pay with that, so to speak, in that it gets very, the burden is very heavy when you get a piece of equipment and there's a tech refresh this year, there's a tech refresh the next year, and it's just complicated by the additional tech refreshes. So the airmen, these young kids out there, they're getting so much information, so much new technology pushed on them so quickly that it's hard for them to become specialist experts in the very basic, the fundamental platform that provides that capability. So kind of speaking out of both sides of my mouth there, we need fast, timely, relevant capability that's affordable, but at the same time, we don't need so much that we're putting the burden on the airmen. And then the second piece, if I was king for the day, it would be to try to figure out a way to deliberately develop all of us. So what does that career path look like from a whole of government perspective? We're very good at educating and being trained on chemistry, physics, you name it, but those are very stovepipe pathways. And there's jobs out there, there's positions for each one of those. But if you look at a countering WMD, a CBRN passive defense, CBRN consequence management, SME, subject matter expert, what does that look like, both in uniform and out of uniform? And so maybe there's an opportunity to build a CWMD Center of Excellence. Again, whole of government that integrates industry, public, private, federal, all together, where we can start from day one. As soon as these kids come out of high school, we're pushing them in some type of academic institution that specializes in developing one of us, that we were just fortunate to gain that level of expertise for years and years of doing this business. I don't think we can wait that long going forward. So again, timely and relevant.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Ladies and gentlemen, we're starting to wind down here. I'm seeing they just took the Slido off the screen, so we probably have time for one, maybe two more questions, and I'll save those for anybody in the audience. If you have any last-minute questions, please come up to the mic. Okay. Well, nothing heard. Well, I'll just kind of leave it for closing comments from our panelists here then. Again, truly appreciate everybody's time. We have a wealth of experience here representing all different parts of the military, different organizations from different combatant commands. Any closing comments from anybody on the panel or anything you'd like the audience to take away? Kind of one last plug, what we're looking for in future technologies or anything else that's kind of on our mind up here that we'd like to ask anybody else out there or just tease out for thought.
Pixie dust and tricorder.
I like it. We got pixie dust, we got wearable technology that, micro needles. Anybody else, any foods for thought?
Thanks for all you do, and the invitation's open. Aloha.
You go to Hawaii, right? Yep, perfect. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, then, if there's no other questions, I want to thank you for your time, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. So how about a round of applause for our panelists here, please?